Good afternoon, and welcome to SportWorks Talks. My name's Christian Page, and with me today is Matthew. Hi, Matthew. How are you?
Hey, Christian. I'm very well, thanks. How you doing?
Very well. Great to have you with us on the program. You're joining all the way from Austria today?
I am indeed. Yes, I am.
Yeah, good stuff. And for all of those who are joining online, great to have you with us. It's a real pleasure to have this talk today, and really important topic. As I put in my post today, it's not about recycling, and it's super important topic. It's not just that it's important; it's essential. And we're super excited to be launching this sustainability series, which is going to be hosted by Matthew. We'll talk a little bit more about that after Matthew's talk. But first of all, just a quick few. Little bit of the rules in terms of how we run our talk. For those of you who haven't joined us before, we have a 20-minute talk by Matthew, and then we're going to have about 20 minutes of Q&A at the end. And we generally just ask that you put your questions into the chat and let us know what you're specifically wanting to ask, and we'll do our best to answer all of the questions. If we run out of time, what we will do is we'll share those questions afterwards and put them into a forum so that you don't get missed out. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Matthew and say welcome to SportWorks Talks. Great to have you.
Christian, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me today. And thank you very much to all of the people who've come to watch our presentation today. So today I'll be putting forward an argument, putting forward an idea that sport, as great a product as it is, can be made even better by being more sustainable, by putting sustainability into its core principles. And I'll be using the word product in a very intentional way. And this will become clear as we go throughout the presentation. The first question we need to address is sport a good product anyway? And I think the majority of us, if not all of us on the call today, will give you an overwhelming yes. Sport is obviously a fantastic product that has stood the test of time over a number of years. And it's down to a number of factors, a couple of which I'll go through just now. In terms of entertainment, sport is unscripted drama. I don't know if any of you have been catching the action from the Australian Open, and even in times, in COVID times, we're still seeing some fantastic entertainment. It keeps millions of people gripped every week. At the same time, it adds structure to our lives. Sports events happen on a yearly, monthly, 4-yearly basis. If we follow league teams, every week we can follow our favorite team. We often build our lives around sport, whether we're playing or whether we're watching sport. But on the flip side of that, it has this unpredictability as well. Even if in many sports there are overwhelming favorites, whether they're elite athletes or big teams, there's still the element of the unknown which really keeps us gripped and keeps us coming back for more, week in, week out. There's obviously an aspirational element. We watch our favorite teams, watch our favorite athletes, and we look up to them. We want to be like them. We want to play like they play. We want to do what they do. And obviously, there's a big element of belonging. We're connected with thousands, if not millions of people worldwide when we follow a particular sport, when we follow a particular athlete, when we follow a particular team. And this element of belonging will be a key theme when we talk about sustainability as it relates to sport as well. But I guess as we're working in the sports industry, and many of us are sports fans, there could be potentially a complacency about us. What we believe to be special about sports, other people, and the new generation of fans, people who aren't necessarily sports fans, may perceive it in a slightly different way. I'm a very big fan of the Sports Innovation Lab, which is based in Boston and headed up by their ex-Olympian Angela Ruggiero. They've done some fantastic research over the past couple of years, and I'm sure many of you watching this will be familiar with their Fluid Fans research, which looks at the evolution of fans over a period of time and is looking at the modern day fan, which they call the Fluid Fan. And they call them the Fluid Fan because they're more willing to change their minds. They have more choice than ever before, and they're continuously evolving. They want purpose with things that they interact with. And the Fluid Fan research is striking. And I know many of you, when I call sport or refer to sport as a product, it may seem a little unromantic. And I suppose I kind of agree with that in some respects, because when I engage with my favorite sports team, for example, that engagement, that transaction, if you like, is a little more romantic. There's a little more in the heart than if I'm buying a pair of jeans, for example, or going food shopping. But when fans and people engaging with sport are changing their attitudes and behaviors to this extent, we have to start thinking of sport as more of a product and start designing it to meet their expectations. When we talk about product development, product design, and Christian will know this better than me because he's obviously into technology, and technology is his thing, but we look at user experience and user interaction. And I want to take a look at Peter Morville's user experience honeycomb here, which is 7 criteria for the development of a good product. This is generally used for software or technological purposes, but this can apply to any type of product. And I think if you look at all 7 of these criteria, sport ticks a number of these boxes. For example, even the useful criteria, Morville states that it's not particularly just about functionality, but a useful product is something that amuses us, entertains us, something that we enjoy. So sport definitely fits that criteria as well. It's not just about functionality in its truest sense. But what we're going to look at today more specifically are the 2 elements in the feel aspect of this matrix, which is credibility and desirability. And this is where the focus on sustainability and sport comes into play when we think about sport as a product. So a credible product is a product that does exactly what it says it's going to do. If you buy a product that you want to clean your floor, you expect to clean floor after you use it. And when people interact with brands, products, organizations, they expect a certain level of service or a certain level of conduct. And this goes for sport too. And the expectations are growing, particularly around the environment. An interesting piece of research that came out last year by Havas Sport and Entertainment shows that 87% of prosumers, what they call forward-thinking consumers or ahead-of-the-curve consumers, believe sport must take action to reduce its negative environmental footprint. Not the most recent PwC sports survey, but the one previously, the 2019 sports survey, asked sports leaders where they think sport could improve most. And the majority, 57%, said that sport should improve transparency and good governance. And being really intentional about sustainability and the environment falls under this good governance now. And one of the biggest indicators of how sustainability improves products, brands, is looking at how sports' main partners, its sponsors, interact with sustainability. 6 out of 10 of the largest sponsors in sport by spend in the US publish sustainability data on a regular, I think, a yearly basis. And all of them communicate about sustainability in some respects. So these huge, massive brands sport interacts with know that sustainability improves their product and improves their brand in the eyes of the consumer. Desire is obviously a really strong emotion and a really positive emotion, and evidence is suggesting that fans, sports fans, and consumers in general want to interact and associate with brands that they see to be social and socially and environmentally responsible. An interesting piece of research that came out last year from Nielsen post-pandemic showed that 75% of sports fans now have an increased interest in brands that seem to be more socially responsible and also environmentally responsible. But even before the pandemic started, Deloitte found that fans are willing to establish a deeper connection with teams if they cared about relevant causes or values that are interesting to them. And most interestingly, Whelan and Kronthal-Sacco found that consumers are actually willing to spend more on sustainable products and services. And this has been a bit of a bone of contention in previous years, because consumers will take surveys to say that they are more keen on buying sustainable products and more environmentally friendly products. But there's been a school of thought that when they do spend their money privately, that is not their top concern. But research is showing that the brands that are more environmentally friendly are growing at an increased rate than brands that aren't, which shows that the consumers are spending money on more environmentally friendly products. So the desire is there. And now, in a post-COVID world, the sports industry, we have an opportunity to shape the sports industry in a more positive way. We've got an unbelievable opportunity despite the challenges that we face. And in my view, reshaping the sports industry without taking these changing attitudes and expectations around sustainability, around environment into consideration, is like a coach watching their team losing from the sidelines without even thinking about changing tactics. And in my view, placing sustainability at the heart of your club, your league, your federation will undoubtedly make it a better product. There was a piece of research that came out just yesterday from Nielsen that showed that sports organizations, rights holders that are really intentional about sustainability will grow their revenues by 11% over the next 3 to 5 years. Today, we're specifically looking at fan engagement and sport as a product from that point of view. But during the sustainability series, we'll be looking at other aspects such as organizational efficiency, risk management, aligning with local and national objectives, strong commercial partnerships as well as was also part of this, and also creating a USP, a unique selling point for your organization, and building that around sustainability. We'll be talking about that more in future episodes, but I'd like to talk about a couple of examples that I think are pretty pertinent and really, really interesting. Now, to many of you, recyclable aluminium cups may not be the most exciting thing to talk about, but the fact is sport has to find a way to reduce the waste that it generates during events, particularly when it comes to food and beverage provision for fans when fans start coming back into stadiums. And Ball Corporation, which is based in the US, has created this this recyclable cup, which they say is infinitely recyclable, which obviously, if this stacks up, is fantastic from a planetary perspective, but also from a sporting perspective. If this is adopted en masse by lots of organizations, this feeds circular economy principles into sport on a really, really grand scale. So they partnered with Kroenke Sports and Entertainment last year, and we wrote an article about this in the sustainability report. And the Kroenke Sports and Entertainment is the entity that owns big brands like Arsenal Football Club, the LA Rams NFL team, lots of Denver-based sports franchises. And they realized that sustainability on its own was not enough in terms of increasing fan engagement and making this a better product. So they did some research and they found that, first of all, the cup, in terms of user experience, was better than those single-use plastic cups. So when you're going to a game, you're carrying 2 or 3 beers for your friends, and all of the liquid spills out because you're squeezing it and it falls out. This particular product, from a user experience point of view, is they found to be better than that. But also, more interestingly, when we do see spectators come into venues en masse again, they want to use gamification to make sustainability a really interesting part of the match day experience. So one of the things that they are considering, one of the things that they spoke about during the interview I conducted last year, was having this idea of creating recyclable bins around the venue with player names. And then when a fan wants to vote for their man of the match, woman of the match, MVP, they can put their cup into the bin to vote for their favorite player. So that creates value in many ways. So it creates added value for the fan, so they have a better, more fun game day experience. It creates efficiencies for the organization. It is better for the environment, and it's accelerating circular economy in sport. So in this respect, this is an example of where sustainability can make sport a better product. The second example I want to touch upon is the example of TSG Hoffenheim, which is a Bundesliga club. And to be honest, it's a Bundesliga club that is not very well liked in many respects, because it's one of the few Bundesliga clubs that is owned primarily by one person, by a tech billionaire. They've got a very strong fan-owned culture in the German Bundesliga. And they started off as a very small team, and they built their way up and became a fixture in the Bundesliga. They've played in the Champions League, I think, once, maybe even twice. And they've put sustainability at the very heart of many of the things they're doing. They've got it at the heart of their sponsorship strategy. You can see in the top left-hand corner, they've got a naming rights partnership with PreZero, which is a waste management company. They've even got a sustainable textiles brand in Africa, which I'd recommend you do some more reading about when you've got more time. I don't have an awful lot of time to go through this in more detail. But the most interesting thing from a fan perspective and I guess a product development perspective, using sustainability to increase engagement, was the climate ticket project that they launched just before COVID, a few months before COVID, where they gave fans the opportunity to buy match tickets. And I think fans could spend either 50 cents or maybe €1 extra when they buy the match ticket. And that would go towards the reforestation project in Africa. I think it was in Uganda. And this gives fans a very seamless, barrier-free way to interact with sustainability, to do something that's good for the environment, and really engages them and sees that their football team is doing more than the average team beyond their core product of winning games on the pitch. Before I end the presentation, I wanted to tell a couple of stories. The first one happened about just about 18 months ago now, and I was invited to interview World Athletics President Seb Coe. I've been trying to get this interview for quite a while now, because a few months before that, even a year before that, they launched this very interesting air quality project. I'm sure some of you already know about this, where they found something about sustainability that was really intrinsic to their core stakeholders, you know, elite and recreational runners, air quality, and they decided they wanted to do something about it. So I was invited to have a 10-15-minute interview with Seb Coe before a Diamond League meet in Zurich in, I think, August or September 2019. So I took a night train down there. I thought this is a great opportunity. I'm speaking to a really big hitter about a really important topic. And I met him probably about half an hour before the Diamond League event happened. He'd been speaking to journalists all day. He's probably a bit tired of getting questions throughout the day. But we sat there and I started talking about sustainability and started talking about their air quality project. And he just came alive. And he started telling me about how important sustainability was for the future growth of the organization, why air quality particularly was really interesting. And what he said to me was really important. He said to me that the World Athletics want to make a practical contribution on this. He said, we want our sport to say something about the big issues. We want our sport to say something about the big issues. And I asked him why. And what he said was, in my opinion, even more profound. He said, young people, don't just look at your organization as a political party or a sports federation or a tech company. They look at you and ask a fundamental question. Do you look like the world that I live in? Do you look like the world that I want to live in? They want purpose. And I know that purpose has become a little bit of a buzzword in recent times. But the fact is that many consumers, and not just young consumers, many consumers, and this stretches to sports fans, they want the brands and companies that they associate with to go beyond their core product and make sustainability part of their core product and purpose part of their core product. About a year before that, in 2018, I was at a sports conference where there were two kind of well-respected sports journalists on stage debating about women's sports. To be clear, they weren't being at all disparaging about women's sports. They weren't saying that women's sport was any lesser than men's sports. But what they did say was that there was no real commercial imperative for them to cover women's sport on their media channels because the interest just wasn't there. And I think in the past 2.5 years since that conference, I think that notion, that idea has been dispelled a little bit because women's sport has obviously grown massively in interest in that over that period of time. And I think it's fair to say that women's sport is one of sport's true growth areas. And the reason why I say this is because I don't want sustainability in sport to be thought of in the same way that it's just a bit of a fad, something that can sit on the periphery of sport. And I think there are a number of organizations who are showing that sustainability can be a core part of a sporting organization and make it a more attractive proposition because of that. I've got a couple of examples here, which I'm happy to talk about in the discussion because I know that my 20 minutes presentation is coming to an end shortly. But for example, we have Real Betis, who have become one of the signatories to the Climate Pledge. And they're obviously putting sustainability at the very heart of what they're doing. The Portland Trail Blazers NBA team is a very good case study, which I'm happy to discuss a bit more in the discussion. We also have World Surf League and Extreme E, which will be starting in a couple of weeks' time, which really puts climate and sustainability really at the heart of sport. In fact, the climate and sustainability aspect is even more, I would say, engaging than perhaps even the sporting aspect. And this is a great way of engaging fans who are not probably not even traditional sports fans, but people who are just interested in interesting ways that we can do things to improve our world. So I suppose that one thing I would say is to imagine a world in which sport becomes a leading industry in sustainability, and imagine the role that we can play in that by making our organizations more sustainable and therefore making our sports and our teams and our leagues and federations better products for the stakeholders that engage with them. Before I leave you, I want to discuss 3 kind of key considerations. And as much as making sustainability a core part of your sport is really important, and it's obviously, as I've kind of mentioned in my presentation, I think it makes sport and organizations better products, better propositions for consumers. The action that you do take around sustainability has to be real and meaningful. And many of the speakers who will be speaking in this leadership series will be talking about real and meaningful projects that they're doing and showing that sustainability, how it can be a core part of business. The second aspect is that it has to be a natural fit with your organization. And just going very quickly back to the World Athletics example, showing that, air quality, runners, there's a natural fit there because they can see that the people, their core stakeholders, are being impacted by an environmental risk. So there is definitely a natural fit there. And there's some great research coming out of the US now. Some friends of mine who run the Sport Ecology Group, and Dr. Madeline Orr, who's one of the co-founders of that. She'll be one of our speakers in the series coming up. And Brian McCulloch, some of their colleagues have done some research around fan engagement and sustainability. And it shows that if you look at sustainability on a very kind of localized level, it can become more engaging for people. So rather than looking at this big macro overwhelming climate change that people in some respects kind of shy away from. For example, if you're a sports team located, a coastal sports team, you can look at things like ocean plastics, for example, or rising sea levels, things that fans in your locality and your stakeholders will care about. And this feeds a little bit into the third consideration, which is around communication. And there was a really interesting piece of research that came out about a week ago. I can't remember where I saw this, but it looked at sustainability communication and how it's being done wrong in many respects. And how communication has to be honest, it has to be non-cliche, it has to be personal. So if you're at the very start of your journey, sustainability-wise, say it, communicate that and show what you're doing to kind of improve on that. Try and refrain from using kind of generic terms like green and moving away from this big macro view of climate change, and find a target audience that you really want to connect with, these fans you want to connect with, and make it really an important part of their lives. So if you want to read about more of these, find out more about these sustainability leaders, I encourage you to come to the Sustainability Report, subscribe to our newsletter, read our stuff. Feel free to contact me, via email, follow me on LinkedIn, and connect with me that way. But I'm conscious that I really want us to have an interesting discussion. So now I will hand it back over to Christian, and I really welcome your questions and the discussion. So back over to you, Christian.
Great talk, great introduction to the series, Matthew. Thank you so much. Really, I was thinking about this. It's the tip of the iceberg, not to be using a climate change pun, but I think it really is, and it's such an important topic, and we're really, really excited about bringing these topics and these speakers. I think it's as always, if you've got any, please pop your questions into the chat. We'd love to start the conversation. A couple of things that came up in the presentation, the talk, which I really sort of aligned with, it really resonated, was interesting that 75% of the fans are interested in socially aware brands and aligning with that, it's a huge number when you think of the engagement.
It's a huge number. And I think to some extent, what's happened to us over the past year, 18 months, has kind of shaped that a little bit, because people are feeling, I suppose, a little bit vulnerable because of what's happened with COVID. And I think they see that brands, not just sports brands, but brands in general, who are doing things that go beyond their initial scope to make people's lives better, to make the world a better place. It speaks to them more now, because they're experiencing something that is, a pretty negative situation. And when they see brands that are doing something about that, they naturally feel more aligned. And climate change is obviously something similar as well.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's just a great start, and kind of reassuring actually that there is such a level of interest and engagement with it. So we've talked about this series. Why are we doing this? Why are you doing this series?
Why are we doing this? Well, I could spend another 40 minutes talking about why we're doing this, but I'll try and keep this as concise as possible. Yeah. The reason we're doing this is because I think sport needs to look at sustainability as a core function of business now. And I know there are some organizations who are doing this, and there are some really leading organizations that really see this. But I think when we look at sport and sustainability, and we'll see this in the talks going forward, but climate change is having a massive impact on sport. Regardless of the sport that you follow or the sport that you play. And this is just only going to continue to be exacerbated if we don't do something, quick, do something fast about it. And it's not something that can sit on the periphery like, your old school CSR did. When we're talking about strategy and strategic thinking within sport, it has to be thought of in the round, because there's too big an impact climate change is having on sport for sport not to think about it in a very strategic, intentional manner.
Yeah, I think it's great, and I think to bring awareness to the topic, and it's essential. This isn't, you've highlighted it being a core element of sport industry, and I can't agree more. I think it is essential. So coming up, what are the topics? What are the things we're going to be covering in the series?
So we're going to be looking at sustainable sports venues. We've got a really exciting talk happening in a couple of weeks with Badur Almir, who is the sustainability director, I think, from Qatar 2022 World Cup. We'll be speaking about a lot of the work they're doing around the World Cup and sustainable venues and that kind of stuff. We'll be looking at risk as well, climate change risk, how sports organizations can mitigate risk from climate change. And Dr. Madeline Orr, who's going to be speaking about that. We'll also be looking at gamification. I think I alluded to that in my presentation around what Ball Corporation are doing, but how we can engage fans in a more, I guess, seamless and more engaging way by gamifying the sustainability process. So loads of interesting stuff happening, as well as sustainability strategy and all that good stuff. Yeah, and I think strategy you highlighted there. Sport is about strategy. And if there's any organization or any industry that who understands that, it's the sport industry. So I think developing strategy. We talked about this earlier before your talk about how important procurement is in the process. I work in a lot of the procurement places around the technology space, and I'm always a little bit disappointed to see that there isn't enough understanding around what is sustainability, what does it really mean, especially in bidder responses. And it's such an important question to be asked, but it's also a high scoring question. So organizations need to really start thinking about putting it at its core. And I think it'll be great to be digging into these topics to create greater awareness. So looking forward to that. So there's some great questions coming through on the chat. If you don't mind, I'm going to drop into those. One here from Adam. Thanks for the question, Adam. In your work trying to raise awareness around this subject, what are the biggest challenges you face? Well, I suppose one of the biggest challenges is that I think I get a sense that the majority of people in sport don't quite see sustainability as a core function of business yet. I suppose that's the main challenge, is that I think we're still looking at results on the pitch, revenue generation, those are the, broadcast rights, the traditional things that people think about in sport will be kind of main topics of concern. And now with COVID lumped into that as well, people will be thinking about health and safety with regards to athletes and getting people back into venues safely. So I suppose what I'm trying to do, Adam, is increase awareness and show, real good best practice with the sustainability report so that sport can adopt it a little more. And to show that within these other considerations, that sustainability has got a part to play in all of the traditional considerations that sport should have anyway.
Great. Okay. Thanks for that. Hope that's clear for you, Anna. I hope that helps. Question here from Anna. Thanks, Anna. Hi, Matthew. In the sustainability world, we are talking about regenerative businesses as the next step for sustainable initiatives. How do you imagine the world of sport being not only sustainable, but also regenerating ecosystems?
There's a really, really interesting question. So sustainability, when we think about sustainability, I think we naturally think about, doing less bad, like limiting the negative aspects. But Anna's question is really pertinent because I think we're in such a situation now that we need to think about accentuating the positive stuff. And I think sport has a really interesting role to play here. So one of the things that I can think of straight away is some of the work that the IOC has done with the IUCN around biodiversity and how sport, when you're looking at venues, looking at events, not just doing less harm on the location that you're going to come and play and have spectators, but when you're planning these events, thinking about how you can fit into the natural landscape and how you can improve the natural landscape. There's some interesting things happening in many aspects of sport. There's some good work happening in golf. Le National in Paris, I think for the ride a few years ago, did a really big piece of work around biodiversity as well. But I think that, yes, so I think there's a bit of a leap to go from sustainability to regenerative in sport, because I think we're still grappling with this notion of sustainability. But definitely sport has definitely got a role to play in the kind of more ambitious objectives, I would say, yeah.
Great. So we'll go on to the next question. Thanks for that. Thanks for your question, Anna. Question here from Sarah. Thanks, Matt. Does your thinking include travel? from Sarah from the Fly Green Alliance.
Yeah, traveling is so you talked about procurement a few minutes ago, Christian, and I think for many sports the biggest environmental impact they'll have will be kind of indirect ones. So, the procurement of their products and services and fan travel as well. And I suppose in many respects, sport is going to have to totally rethink fan travel anyway, particularly in light of COVID. Climate change has to be a factor when thinking about this. I think sport will have to think about how, looking at how it looks at its schedule and thinks about hosting events, trying to bring them closer together geographically at the same time, potentially. So there's not a huge amount of traveling to do for fans and athletes, because you don't want to be going from Canada to Australia to Europe for your main events. But that is a question that I hope that we'll answer throughout this series, but it's a really difficult one for sport to grapple with. Probably the most difficult one, I'd say, when it comes to the environment. Yeah,
no, that's good. And great question. Thanks, Sarah. Question here, will you cover motorsports, from Anne Law?
So I'm hoping to cover motorsports. We've invited a couple of guests who will be hopefully covering motorsports, because that's a really, really interesting topic. Because I think when we think about traditional motorsports, we think about, really loud cars going around the track and, petrol engines and noise and smell. But we're seeing, some new entities like Extreme E. Well, Formula E is not particularly new, but in relation to Formula One, obviously it is. But we're seeing these new kinds of sports, which are really putting sustainability at the heart of what they're doing, and in fact driving things like electric car adoption. Extreme E is going to go to some of the most remote parts of the world to show what climate change is doing to our planet, really putting it at the front and center. And in Formula One has stepped up as well. They're looking at sustainable fuels. They're looking at becoming carbon neutral. I mean, if you'd have said 10 years ago Formula One's going to become carbon neutral, who'd have imagined that? So I think motorsports is definitely stepping up, and hopefully we'll have some content during this series around motorsport.
Great. Looking forward to that. Question here from Jens. Thanks for your question, Jens. Thank you, Matthew. Great talk. Sustainability seems to be for you mainly the issue of climate change. What about the other aspects, like socioeconomic? Great question.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, sustainability in its truest sense is everything in around, really. So everything has to be viable, so economically viable. You have to make sure that people are accommodated as well. So it has to be socially acceptable as well, and also environmental. So yeah, I mean, if you're going to be, as an organization, planning a sustainability strategy or sustainability projects of any kind, you've got to take all three into account, because if it's not economically viable, then obviously it's very difficult to have a project with any impact. So yeah, I mean, this particular talk is looking mainly at the environment, but absolutely, when you consider it, you have to consider it in the rounds.
Yeah, and then that was we touched briefly on this before we came on the talk, and we talked about, again, not to go back to procurement, but it's also about the ecosystem, and it's the supply chain and things that can make a big difference to how an event can be delivered. And I know we mentioned this briefly. It's an area that Paris 2024 is particularly paying a bigger piece of attention to, not in terms of sustainability, but also about their whole procurement strategy and how they're going to deliver the games, which again will be an interesting topic to cover. But it's a great question. Thanks for asking it. So a question here from Danny. Absolutely. If you're into winter sports, you can't ignore climate change, as mountain environments are seeing changes happen faster and winter seasons are simply getting shorter. That's absolutely true. Although we've been fortunate this season, none of us have been able to really visit the slopes. So it's a challenge, but it is a great point you raised. Thanks for sharing that, Danny. So question here from Gustavo. When it comes to sport and sustainability, it seems that there are at least 4 aspects to it: media coverage, bringing awareness, fan base supporting the cause, development of technology and solutions, and political interest in bringing sustainability to the center. Are all these aspects developing in the same pace? Or maybe there is one that is way ahead and the other one that is a little bit behind. Which need more attention, and why?
That's a great question. And I suppose it will differ from place to place, and in this respect, I guess from sport to sport, because in some sports you'll see the political will there. So, for example, if we look at the World Athletics example, you've got support from the president. The political will is there to do something, and naturally everything else, the innovation kind of falls into place, and it works in that way. So I guess in some respects, a lot of it will be driven by outside forces, by external forces, by political will, not just within sports organizations, but within governments. We're seeing a lot in Europe, particularly around this Green Deal happening, and that's going to drive a lot of innovation, which will seep its way into sport, no doubt, in many respects. And I think when that external need is there, from both, political will and also from fans, because fans and sponsors is also an interesting one to talk about as well. To, sponsor will to see things happen. To naturally, you'll see those innovations come more to the fore because there's a need for them to be created.
So does that fit in with the concept, and you mentioned it earlier, it's a bit of a buzzword around purpose, partnerships for purpose, and we've had some great talks around sponsorship and the need for that. Do you see the sponsorship side driving some of the behavior change in sports?
I think in many ways it will, even more so than the fans in many ways, because the sponsors are where the money is. And we're seeing, sponsors, we're talking about massive companies, many of whom will have their own sustainability reports already, many of whom will even have designated chief sustainability officers, people who are working on this as their primary role. And as they are kind of maturing these sustainability objectives, they'll naturally want to align with organizations that are doing similar things. So if they see that an event or a sport partner that they've traditionally worked with are not doing the right things and have no intention of doing similar things, then naturally that interest is going to wane a little bit because there's a risk from their side as well. They have to align with companies and entities that are doing the right thing environmentally and socially as well. So sponsorship is definitely going to be driving this in many respects, in my opinion. Yeah,
it's great, and it's a great point you raise, because I think sponsorship is a core part of the survivability of the sports industry. It's part of the feed here, including broadcast. But I know, having worked for the couple of the top sponsors at the Olympic Games, how important this and how sensitive and how important it is to deliver the event with their brands represented. So I completely agree. I think it's going to be one of the key drivers behind shifting this to becoming a core facility. So we'll see how that evolves. That's great. So thanks for that question, Gustavo. A comment here from Raisa. Thanks. Building in, Danny, public health advocacy, access to care and non-communicable diseases critical to sports athletes and general population. Yeah, it's true. I think it's a good comment you're making in the overall looking at sustainability. Question here from Yanis. Thanks for your question. Do you believe that European club sports are more keen on sustainable policies than sports clubs in the US, Africa, or in Asia? And so follow-up is, in what degree do local governments support the club's environmental projects and initiatives?
Well, I suppose it's a difficult question to answer, because there are leaders in Europe and in the US, and there are also some organizations leading in other parts of the world as well. I suppose we tend to look at the European and the American sports scene mainly because, in general terms, they're the richer leagues. So you talk about the NFL, NBA, the Premier League, where the money is, and they've got the resources to make a big impact on these particular topics. I mean, there are leaders on both sides of the pond, but I mean, I don't think it's geographically driven. I think it's driven mainly by switched on owners, by owners who know that they have to do something about sustainability, and mainly around also fan attitudes as well, because I think we'll see fan attitudes varying from geography to geography as well. So I don't think it's necessarily just geographically. I think it's just to do with resources and to do with other factors like that.
Okay. So thanks for the question, Giannis. That's great. Another question here from Laurent. How can a young startup that mix sports sustainability and sponsorships could reach out to major players in the sport world, sports organizations and athletes?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, one of the great examples, I mean, you mentioned Paris 2024 earlier, and one of the great things they're doing is they've set aside a certain amount of their budget for smaller social enterprises, startups, to get a certain part of their procurement budget. So in many ways, a lot of these startups will find it very difficult to work with big organizations like Paris 2024 or other Olympic Games or other sports organizations or events. But I think in many ways they'll try and partner them up with other bigger organizations so they get a slice of the pie as well. But I think in many ways sport may have been a little bit of a close shot for smaller startups, but I think now attitudes are driving them to think about more sustainable options. There may be a window of opportunity for startups to get in there, particularly when it comes to tender processes, and if they can partner with big organizations to create a bigger product.
Yeah. To your point there about Paris 2024 as well, just in follow-up, there is a drive behind building sustainable ecosystem beyond just the games delivery. And I know it is something that we talked about earlier about the Inner Sports Hub is working on as well, to look at ways to develop those organizations, smaller organizations that can compete with the bigger organizations. So they're very progressive, the Paris 2024 team around the procurement and looking at this piece. So my suggestion is to certainly look them up. And if you want some more information, we can pop that in after the talk. But thank you.
To that point, I think a lot of the sports startup hubs around the world, like La Plaine in Paris, for example, I think more and more of those startups that they're incubating there will have a sustainability focus, either socially or environmentally. So I think it's becoming more of an investment proposition as well. So I think there's good opportunity going forward potentially.
And hopefully throughout this series, if you can stay with us, then you might be able to pick up some other leads on how the different hubs that are doing this. So again, something we may look to try and cover in this series. So thanks for that, Laurent. Question here from Ruben. Thanks for a great presentation, Matthew. You said that sport has to look at sustainability as a core part of achieving its agenda. Given that almost everyone has a contact or another with sports, how have you been engaging the sustainability world to look at sports as a core strategy to achieving their sustainability goals?
That's a very good point, because when we're looking at, so the majority of this conversation has been about sport looking to the private sector to help sport become more sustainable. But I think in many ways you're right. Sport has got an even bigger cultural pull for the private sector. I mean, that's why there's huge sponsorship deals, because organizations want to be aligned with sports. So I think naturally sport can be leveraged to help with wider sustainability goals. I think you're looking at kind of athlete engagement as well, because athletes are obviously the biggest draw for these big brands. I mean, if you could get 2 or 3 big athletes involved in a big sustainability drive, I mean, that would obviously bring a sustainability objective of an organization to the fore in people's minds. So I don't think sport is quite there yet, but that is definitely something that sport can this is one of the benefits sport can bring to this whole conversation. It's a great question.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for that, Rubens. So a question here from Hayes. We've got a little bit of time for a couple more. We've got some great questions coming through. Don't worry. We will cover the questions, and maybe we'll be able to pick them up, some of them in some of the follow-up in the series. But we will also pop these in the forum. So if we don't get to your question, don't worry. We will get to an answer for it. So there's a question here from Raisa. What incentives exist to motivate governing bodies to support sustainability?
Well, I would say the biggest incentive would be, I suppose there's threefold, and 2 of them we've covered already in fans and sponsorship. But I think one of the biggest incentives is seeing the big sports leaders actually doing something about it. So, for example, if you look at the IOC, for example, the IOC obviously made sustainability a key plank of what they're doing, Agenda 2020. They're writing sustainability criteria into their host city contracts, so that when you're bidding for the Olympic Games, there's certain criteria that you have to set before you even think about hosting your games. They're one of the biggest proponents of the UN Sports for Climate Action framework, which is a big collective of organizations who have committed to climate action by a certain period of time. So I think one of the biggest incentives, bar sponsorship being more appealing to commercial sponsors and being more appealing to fans, is just aligning with the big organizations in sport and showing that you're actually doing what they're doing, and feeling that kind of that collective movement of sport doing something about sustainability. So I think when we're seeing the bigger sports organizations moving in that direction of travel, as maybe a smaller governing body, if you're doing something similar, you could see in many ways your stock increase because of that. So I think that's a huge incentive to look at what the big guys are doing and try and replicate that.
Yeah, I think the other key incentive is also, you mentioned earlier in the talk, was about incentivizing to keep your fans engaged and looking at the next generation as well, because this is sustainability and climate change and all of these topics are incredibly hot. As Seb Coe said, what are the kids thinking of? So there is also that ensuring, I guess, and mitigating a risk of losing your fan base by not participating in sustainability at its core. So I think there's another key point that you've already addressed. So great question. Thanks for that. Okay, so I've got time for probably just 2 more. One here from Christiani. Thanks, Christiani. How can we overcome the shift in the sponsorship deals towards more sustainable sponsors in sports?
Well, I think that shift is already happening to a small extent, and that'll probably happen a little bit more. I mean, we're seeing sponsorship deals being big sponsorship deals crafted to some extent around sustainability. Towards the back end of last year, we saw the re-signing of the IOC and Procter & Gamble partnership having an element of sustainability about it with this athletes fund, where they'd be giving funds out to athletes who are doing a social or environmental project. And sustainability seems to be at the heart of that particular activation. Towards the end of the year, we saw UEFA renegotiating its partnership with Pepsi as well. And a big part of that was the drive around reducing single-use plastics and recycling as well. So I think more and more we'll be seeing at least parts of activations having a sustainability angle. And in fact, I think this is going to become mainstream going forward. That maybe not the whole activation is around sustainability, but there'll be at least one part of the activation that is around sustainability. So I think we'll be seeing much more of that going forward, particularly once we're over the worst of COVID.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we've got time for one more question. Thanks for that question. Rohit, thanks for sending in. Thank you for the presentation, Matthew. The examples given were mainly from sports in the US and Europe. Considering that a big part of Asia are developing countries, there are a lot of sport events which are more business orientated. It will be good to know how this part of the world can take serious steps to combat climate change. It's a great point. Thanks, Rohit. Yeah,
that's a really great question. And when we look at sports like cricket, for example, which is more popular in Asia and in Australasia and in South Africa and the Caribbean, we're looking at a sport that is massively, it's arguably the sport that is impacted most by climate change because the weather is part of the game. So that is a huge way.
For those that don't understand cricket, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I won't go to
we get it.
I won't go into too much of that detail now because we'll be here for another 45 minutes. But I mean, if we're trying to engage, other parts of the world in that conversation, is looking at sports that are intrinsically impacted by climate change and trying to get them involved. I know that the IPL a little while ago were doing a lot around single-use plastic. I think a couple of IPL teams are doing some work around that. There are some organisations in Australia who are starting to do some work around, sustainable venues as well. So there is happening in other parts of the world. I suppose. We're concentrating mainly on Europe and the US because of geography. That's where I'm based, and this is where most of my contacts are. And that's where most of the editorial content I write about comes from those particular geographies. And also, I think because the majority of the leagues in those particular geographies have most of the resources and a lot of exposure worldwide in terms of fans and sponsors.
Yeah. So, but it is a great point, and I think we're looking at the series ahead. It might be something we can take on board.
Sure.
I think to look at that. So, all of the questions fantastic. Really appreciate everyone's participation. Great to have you all join us. We run a little bit over time, so apologies for that. But at the same time, I think great kickoff to this really super excited series around the sustainability leadership. Matthew, great talk. Great to have you on the program, and looking forward to handing over the baton for you hosting this next series.
Thanks, Christian, and thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks for the great questions. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to seeing you for the rest of our series.
Great stuff. Okay, for everyone, thanks again for joining. And for now, stay safe wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye for now.